I'm going to talk about two things. I'm going to talk about the fall of the Assyrian state, um, and I'm going to talk about the fall of the empire. So the Assyrian state, you could think of it as the homeland, and then I'm going to talk about the homeland's hold over the entire Near East. In other words, all the provinces and all the vassals throughout the very large empire that Assyria was. So what does this period represent? It's a very important question for Assyrians today, for Assyrians in the past. It represents the end of a powerful and centralized Assyrian state. In other words, the Assyrian homeland, as we knew it, was centered in Nineveh. Religiously, it was centered in the city of Ashur, and militarily, it was dominated by the military machine of Assyria, particularly in the homeland, but also on the outskirts of the homeland. So the homeland was the center, and the periphery was the rest of the empire, composed of over 70 provinces and many, many vassal states that surrounded the heartland. So this period, the fall of Assyria, represents a shift from a very powerful Assyrian presence in the homeland to a loss of that powerful presence in the homeland. It's the end of a strong military Assyrian force on a regional or international level. So we will not see, again, in Assyrian history, Assyrian military forces that can change regional outcomes. We will not see Assyrian forces impacting international politics or international systems from this point on. So again, a major transformation in Assyrian history. It's the end of an economic center, and we have to know what this means, and its ability to engage in building activities and projects on a grand scale in the land of Assyria. So when we look at Assyrian architecture, and we look at Assyrian art, and we look at Assyrian road systems, we look at Assyrian water projects, we look at Assyrian systems of communication. For example, what we call the Pony Express in ancient Assyria, where mail was being delivered back and forth, and various technologies. We will not see that anymore. And partly it's because the Assyrian economic system has collapsed. In other words, there is no person, there is no center to be able to relate to the periphery, no capital city left to be able to communicate with the provinces. The capital city is gone, and so the economic system, which was based in Nineveh at this time, is no longer existing. It is fractured, and the center that is going to control the Assyrian people from this period on is going to come from somewhere else. It is a transformation of the Assyrian psyche. The very essence of the Assyrian people is going to change now from 612 or 609 BC. 605 BC, really towards the end of the 7th century, Assyria goes from a dominant power to a subservient people and a dark age, at least for many years to come. So the Assyrians are going to experience not only the downfall of their kingdom, but a dark period in their history where we are not going to hear the voices of the Assyrian people as much as we hear the voices of others. So major transformation. Everything that we know so far, everything that we know about Assyria so far, we know it to be a very powerful kingdom, a very wealthy kingdom, a very sophisticated, administratively sophisticated kingdom, an empire. All that is going to change now. And it's going to change in a way that people are going to be shocked, because the grandfather of King Ashurbanipal, who is the father of the two kings that survived afterwards and get to see the fall of the empire, had prayed and had asked for, in his prayer, that his kingdom, his throne, be preserved for all centuries. And one wish, of course, came true, where he asks that my sons, my grandsons, my dynasty, and my descendants endure among humanity for all eternity. That certainly came out to be true. But it was not to be with the throne of Assyria, which had lasted for over possibly 2,000 years and over 700 years of being the dominant power in the Near East, to being a subservient people. So that was about to change. And the shock came also because whenever we look back at Assyrian history, the Assyrian people who converted to Christianity became members of various churches: the Church of the East, the Syriac Orthodox Church, the Chaldean Church, the Syriac Catholic Church, and so on. All, of course, use the Bible as a reference. And when we go in the Bible from a sentence like this in Ezekiel, behold, the Assyrian was a cedar in Lebanon with fair branches and with a shadowing shroud and of high stature, and under his shadow dwelt all great nations. When we go from something like this to this passage in Nahum 3:18, thy shepherds slumber, O king of Assyria, thy nobles shall dwell in the dust, thy people is scattered upon the mountains, and no man gathereth them. So we go from reading passages like this in the Bible, we often think, and this is the biblical reference to the fall of Assyria here, we often think that, the fall of Assyria happened very quickly, that the fall of Assyria came very suddenly, shocking. Certainly it was shocking, but it did not come very quickly, as we're going to see. But it's important to know that our understanding today, being shaped by the experience that we as an Assyrian people have experienced during the very difficult years of the First World War, where something like 2/3 of the Assyrian nation was lost to famine, massacres, persecution. This is a very, very traumatic period in time for the Assyrians, but we're also really understanding the past, the fall of Assyria, through that lens. So when we know what happened to our people 100 years ago, we can kind of speculate that what happened over 2,500 years ago was on a much grander scale. Oftentimes, Reverend Wigram would make a comment about the Assyrians that participated in the First World War, was that their conflict as the smallest ally, what he called Britain's smallest ally, the Assyrians was a kind of a side theater to the main occurrence in the First World War, which was the battle between the Ottoman state and the British and others. Well, you have to understand that what we're going to be discussing today was very much in the center stage of the entire world. This was a catastrophic event that took place from the late 600 BCs to about 605 BC, and it had devastating consequences, not only for the Assyrians, but for all of the people living in the ancient Near East. And the fall of Nineveh has been imagined by various artists based on biblical readings, of course, and based on classical readings as something that was really earth-shattering for the entire ancient Near East. And here you see a painting by artist John Martin in England. And now you could tell by the clothing, this was prior to the finding of a lot of the ruins of Assyria. This, however, painting by in Hutchinson's book, This comes in 1915 after the discovery of Assyrian ruins, and so you can kind of see motifs here, various motifs from ancient Assyria. So the destruction of the Assyrian monarchy is imagined here by this artist, with, in addition, of course, there's a flare here. There are elephants here as well, but this very dramatic painting is of the Assyrian king who sets his castle on fire as Nineveh is being surrounded. And we will see where that story comes from, although we've referred to it previously, but we'll see where that story comes from. Now, there's various theories about the great fall of the empire of Assyria. Some think that the Assyrian Empire fell because of its cruelty to the conquered peoples, to the vassal states, and to the provinces, and much has been made about, for example, how the Assyrians were a very cruel people and how the Persians were a very nice people. And the historians who make this comparison, I think, are really not understanding how history works, because the Assyrian Empire lasted much longer, something like 3 times as long as the Persian Empire. So the idea that the Assyrian Empire fell because it was cruel to conquered peoples is not borne out by the historical evidence. So there's nothing in history where we see, for example, someone says, well, these people are cruel, therefore we should rebel against them. There are other motivations, of course, why conflict happens. But the ordinary people, the villagers in for example, a Median town, or the people living in the city of Tyre or Sidon, they did not think in those days of, well, the Assyrian king is cruel. They, thought more that their own king may have been cruel. And people overthrew kings, but certainly wasn't because of cruelty. Things were different during that time. Other people think that the Assyrian Empire fell because of internal dissension. And various authors have mentioned this, that there was conflict within the empire. And there's some truth to this, and we will refer to it a little later. Some historians say that there was economic decline in the empire, and they show evidence of this, declining numbers, for example. There was depletion of resources and dwindling of provincial populations. This is not borne out by very exact science, so it's not exact, it's largely speculation. The fall of the empire was due to climate change. Again, this is a reflection of seeing the past really by looking at our conditions today. So it's speculation, it's theory based on what we know about our world today. And because we're very concerned about climate change today, we kind of superimpose these concerns and this view on the past. So that also is not borne out by the record. Although there are some studies about changes in the environment during this time. And finally, there is a theory that the fall of the empire was due to the style of warfare waged by the Assyrians. And we're going to go into that part in a little more detail. I find this interesting and provocative. And I want to tell you, there's various theories about the fall of empires, most prominently the fall of Rome. How did the Roman Empire come to fall? And there's various theories about that. And I'm not going to go into that area, but I'm just going to mention that the resources for the fall of the Roman Empire during this period of time are much richer than the fall of the Assyrian Empire. And part of the reason is because of the time period. Part of the reason is also because of geographic setting. The Roman Empire collapsed in the west, but it did not collapse in the east, so there was more preservation of records. And we don't have that in Assyrian sources. So we cannot speculate as much as we can speculate about the fall of Rome, about the fall of Assyria. Now, what happened to the Assyrian people? This has been a rather controversial point. Um, the British Museum website tells us that, quote, from this point, in other words, 609 BC, the fall of Assyria in Haran, or the fall of the Assyrian armies in Haran, the Assyrians and their king disappear from history. Well, their king does disappear from history, but the Assyrians do not disappear from history. And so the British Museum has it wrong. Anthropologist Carlton Kuhn, who has been discredited by many reputable sociologists and anthropologists, says that the Assyrians have no direct linguistic or ethnic survivors, which is probably a mercy. And I recall reading this for the first time when I was studying modern Middle Eastern history and just being shocked at the hatred, the contempt that an anthropologist would have towards a people whom he didn't know. He also made some very derogatory remarks about modern Assyrians. So Carlton Kuhn is not a respected anthropologist anymore. He was in the past, but certainly not respected anymore. And historian Stuart Easton and a number of other historians took to saying things like the Assyrians received no mercy as they had shown none. The very people disappeared from history, killed or absorbed into the population of the conquerors. Now, this line of thinking keeps being repeated. You can hear echoes of it, and it just won't go away, unfortunately. It just won't go away. We keep hearing it over and over and over again. And we hear it sometimes, it is echoed in political circles, even among Assyrians themselves. And we're going to get to this when we discuss the modern period. For example, some Assyrians say, well, we're not Assyrian, we are, for example, Syriac, or we are Aramaean, and we are Chaldean, and so on. And so the attack is towards this terminology of people calling themselves Assyrian. And the thinking is that in order to knock that theory down, we have to show and we have to borrow, we have to show that the Assyrians did not survive, and we have to borrow from people like Stuart Easton and Carlton Kuhn in order to buttress our theories. None of this, of course, is true, and that's one of the points that we have in this series of lectures, is to show the continuity of Assyrian history. And one of the examples of the people that don't get it is Stephen Garfinkel. And he says a number of things here in his article, The Assyrians, a New Look at an Ancient Power. Unfortunately, that new look is not really a new look. It's pretty much an old look, parading as a new look. And I've written to Stephen Garfinkel, and I'm expecting a response. So as soon as I know what he says, I will let you know. Stay tuned for that. I'm not entirely sure that he's going to respond. But I asked him. And one of the questions I asked was about some of the comments made here. In particular, the reign of Assyria was not entirely abandoned after the fall of Nineveh, but the urban centers were destroyed and the culture and language of the Assyrians passed into memory. Now, where do you get something like that? I'll tell you where you get it. You get it if you don't carefully study the subject matter. You get it when you take simple ideas advocated by people like Stuart Easton and others, and you put them in a new light and you pretend like it's a new look that you're exposing. So Stephen Garfinkel is very Kuhn-like in his, Carlton Kuhn-like in his view of the Assyrians, and that he believes that they disappeared, and he, in effect, really thanks God that they disappeared, because he tells us here that Assyrian militarism and the expansionist ideological imperatives behind it forced the Assyrians into a perpetual quest to expand their empire. Well, yes. I mean, that's the story of every empire. That's the story of the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, the British, the Americans, the Russians, every empire has expanded. I mean, the task of empire, Mr. Garfinkel, is not to shrink; it's to expand. So, so he just unfortunately hasn't gotten it. The other point that he makes is that the Assyrians had brought in non-Assyrians, and this is also really applied to the fall of the Roman Empire. That well, because there were non-Assyrians in the empire, somehow people just didn't get along because different ethnic groups just don't get along. Well, that's not really borne out by the record. The texts do not refer to that. So whenever you hear theories like this or ideas like this, always ask yourself the question, what's behind this? What is the exhibit which one can attach to an idea like this? So where do we get the idea that ethnic groups were not happy in Assyria? And I'll give you one more example that's very similar to the ideas perpetuated by Mr. Stephen Garfinkel, who's at Western Washington University at this time. There was some years ago a series of books and videos being put out by a group calling itself, I think, the Syriac League or something like that, where they talked about the Holocaust experienced by the Aramaeans by the Assyrians. And what they were doing, what these people had done, these people who were completely misled by history, excuse me, is they superimposed their ideas. Now it's okay if you superimpose some ideas in understanding human nature to the past, but to take ideas like nationalism and superimpose them on the Assyrian Empire and say something like the Assyrians engaged in creating a Holocaust against the Aramaean people is just not true, because it's not borne out by the record. And it's not borne out by the record in particular because when Assyria fell, you never saw a rebellion by the Aramaean nation against the Assyrians. No such thing happened. Neither, I will argue, and we will see, was this a rebellion by, for example, Medes and Babylonians against the Assyrians. This was a conflict over power within the empire. Now, what really happened? So, what are the sources of our knowledge about the fall of Assyria? They fall into several categories here. The first primary are textual sources in Akkadian. And unfortunately, we don't have the voices of the Assyrians who suffered the catastrophe themselves. But we do have Akkadian sources from Babylon recording events. And they're rather dry. The tablets are damaged. They're called the Babylonian Chronicle. And sometimes they're referred to, particular tablets are referred to as the Nineveh Chronicle. And these are the story of what is called the king of Eket, Nabopolassar, who goes into Assyria, who was an Assyrian general, by the way, had served under the Assyrian king who rebelled and formed his own kingdom in Babylon. So we have the Akkadian sources, textual sources, in tablet form. We have Greek and Roman sources, Herodotus, Ctesias. The classical authors offer kind of a dramatic version of the fall of Nineveh, where the last Assyrian king burns himself alive and all of his material possessions. Now, the last Assyrian king, Sin-shar-ishkun, is called in classical sources Sardanapalus. He's confused with Ashurbanipal. Sardanapalus and Ashurbanipal are seemingly one. And largely, the Greek and Roman sources are very unreliable. So they're not really worth pursuing in terms of understanding history. It's just unfortunate, but much of what is written by Herodotus and Herodotus and others who come after Herodotus is not really helpful to understand what happened with the fall of Nineveh. We have, on the other hand, archaeological evidence, burned and destroyed sites and items, and this is still being recovered, and that's very, very important. I mean, just today we heard about discoveries made in the city of Nimrud, and I'm very excited to know what the description says. The description is a large description of King Adad-nirari III. King Adad-nirari III was the son of Samuramat of the Semiramis fame, the Assyrian queen, who was the wife of Shamshi-Adad, king of Assyria. So there is much being discovered, and among many of these archaeological ruins is evidence of a lot of burning, destruction. We also see the destruction on artistic creations of Assyrians, for example, the gouging or the chiseling out of eyes and faces of prominent Assyrian kings like Ashurbanipal, and so that we have that evidence of destruction. We also have Assyrian sources that are yet to be discovered. So we say absence of evidence does not mean evidence of absence. Unfortunately, we don't have what the Assyrians themselves were thinking and saying and communicating during this time, other than one single small reference, and I will share that with you today. So again, absence of that kind of evidence, because the Assyrians were very meticulous in recording various events. But we can kind of gather, we're speculating because we may still be able to dig up. I mean, remember, most Assyrian sites have not been dug up completely. So we may dig up various evidence to show something about what the Assyrians were thinking and what they were experiencing in tablet form, in, for example, cuneiform writing. It's rare that Aramaic writing would survive, but we also have that as well. Although, again, very important to know, the reason why we don't have Aramaic writing at this time, which is being used by the Assyrian Empire, in fact, it is being used so much that the Aramaic language during this time is called the language of the Assyrians. To this day, the rabbis refer to the so-called Hebrew writing, which is really Aramaic, the Aramaic script. They refer to it as Kitab Ashuri, or Assyrian writing. So the reason they refer to it as Assyrian writing is because that's where it came from. It came from the writers within the Assyrian Empire, the center of power, and they propagated the Aramaic language to the rest of the world, and including, as we'll see, Persia, which comes after the Assyrian Empire, the next great empire. Now, the last three kings of Assyria, the last great kings of Assyria, were Ashurbanipal, during whose reign Assyria reigned supreme over the entire Near East and North Africa. Assyria had become the world power of this time. His son Ashur-uballit, for some reason, reigns for a very short period of time, 2-3 years. And then Sin-Shara-Ishkun takes over from 626 to 612 BC. He is the one who experiences the bulk of the fighting that we're going to be talking about today. And then the last king of Assyria is appropriately named Ashur-uballit II. What a tragedy this is, because Ashur-uballit I, as we had studied previously, was the first very unique king of Assyria to take Assyria into a new phase in its civilization of dominating the Near East. He was communicating with the pharaoh. He had turned Assyria into a regional power, of course, riding on the shoulders of previous kings, but this marked a new period of Assyrian history, as we came to know. And of course, Ashur-uballit II, unfortunately, becomes the very last king of Assyria, and we last hear of him in 609 BC, when Haran, the last capital of the Assyrian Empire, falls. Now, what came before this? So there was a little bit of erosion of Assyrian power internally. So there was a civil war fought between Ashurbanipal and his brother Shamash-shum-ukin. As you know, we discussed this before, initiating a 4-year conflict among Assyrians. His brother was crowned the king of Babylon, and Ashurbanipal was crowned the king of Assyria. He was kind of in the center of power. And although Ashurbanipal was victorious and the Assyrian Empire reigned supreme for many decades afterwards, there is this idea among many scholars that perhaps this was really a facade of sorts, because Assyria had weakened itself because of the internal fighting. Now, not only did this happen, did this conflict result, but also before this, Ashurbanipal's father, Sarhaddon, had to deal with two conflicts within Assyria itself. One was with his own brothers, where they tried to take power and were not able to, and they were defeated. And another time when there was a conspiracy against Sarhaddon, and he puts many magnates in Assyria to the sword. And that really was a very difficult time for Assyria, leading scholars like Karen Radner, Assyriologist in Vienna, to speculate that perhaps this was a very devastating blow to the machinery, the bureaucratic machinery of the Assyrian Empire. Now, after Ashurbanipal, he was succeeded by his son, as we said, Ashur-etil-ilani. And Ashur-etil-ilani had issued royal grants and carried out, so things seemed to be going smooth during his reign. When he died, he was succeeded by Sin-shar-ushkun, who was most likely a brother, although we don't know that for sure, and a son of Ashurbanipal. He is thought to have died in the fall of Nineveh in 612 BC. In 626 BC, Nupal-usad, who had been an Assyrian general of Sin-shar-ushkun, claimed the throne of Babylon and separated himself from Assyria, separated himself from the center, I should say, and created another civil war. This civil war, of course, Assyria was not able to recover from. And there's one more thing I want to mention. About the transmission here, the succession. So Ashurbanipal was the brother of Shamash-shum-ukin. Ashur-etil-ilani took over, and then Sin-shar-ushkun, who is the last Assyrian king before Ashur-uballit II. But there's also a eunuch that takes over for about a year. It's a very strange period in Assyrian history. But his power is kind of limited to the southern area. His name is Sin-shum-lisha. And there is some evidence that he considered himself also to be a king. And they have discovered a seal which shows, it's the typical Assyrian king seal slaying a lion that was used in a lot of to stamp a lot of the tablets. His seal is different in that the king is not bearded, and that way we know that he is a eunuch. And of course, we've talked in the past about what eunuchs are. Eunuchs are what we would refer to in modern Assyrian as chosia, which is a male who is castrated. And this is a system that was shared throughout Mesopotamia, a system among rulers who had these people working within their administration, kind of guarding their harems. And it wasn't simply that they were guarding their harems. These are people who do not have offspring, so they're not able to pass the kingdom on to their children, as it were. So they're kind of devoted to taking care of the monarchy and being good servants of the king, who's also the priest of Ashur, as you know. So there is this period of time which may have also led to some conflict here of this person controlling Babylon during this time and possibly aspiring to be king, but that's only for a period of a year. And so that period of time is not clear exactly what happened, but we know that the last Assyrian king who dies in the fall of Nineveh is Sin-shar-ushkun. The struggle between north and south. So the Assyrian Empire was centered, of course, in the Assyrian heartland, but it also included the cities of Akkad. And there was cultural affinity between these people. And they all used the same language with different dialects, of course, what we call the Babylonian and the Babylonian and Assyrian dialect. So there was a struggle between Assyria to reestablish rule in the cities of Akkad. What is termed Babylonia again? It's an anachronistic term. Records show that cities were taken and retaken by one side then the other. So this struggle goes on between north and south. The populations in the cities that were under siege were stricken by disease, oftentimes, and famine. According to one scholar, parents resorted to selling their children to buy food. So this was a very tough time for a lot of people in the Assyrian heartland and in the Mesopotamian area at large. The historical record that Nabopolassar gained power shows that he gained power over Assyria in the south. The fighting moved north to the Assyrian heartland itself. Assyria began to lose its stronghold on the provinces, the Levant, Egypt, and various parts of Anatolia and Iran as it began to center itself on protecting the heartland. As we refer to this source, which is very important, the Babylonian Chronicle, it describes the battle between the king of Assyria and the king of Akkad. And Nabopolassar is called the king of Akkad. Keep remembering that southern Mesopotamia is never referred to by its people as Babylonia. Babylon is one city. The land is not Babylonian. It is called Akkad. And the southernmost land is called Somar. And the area around the Persian Gulf is actually sometimes called the Sea Land. The tablets are damaged and broken, but are witness to the fall of the Assyrian state. The text really starts around 616 BC, so it's very important to keep in mind that the fighting has gone on for about a decade before this, but the text really starts to tell the story in 616 BC, when the king of Babylon, or the king of Akkad, marches north and defeats the Assyrian army in the middle Euphrates, to the west and outside of Madnau to the east. In 615, he successfully attacks the city of Ashur, unsuccessfully, and then retreats to what is Tikrit. It's called Tikritain in the sources. Retreats to Tikrit, and the fighting goes on in Tikrit, in and around Tikrit, between the Assyrian forces and Nabopolassar and his army. So what does the Babylonian Chronicle say? So for example, it's a very dry text, but I'll read you some of the passages here and comment on them. In the month of Adar, so Adar, in the third month, Nabopolassar mustered his army, the army of Akkad, marched along the Euphrates. The Suhians and Hindians, tribes living south of Haran, did not do battle against him, but placed their tribute before him. Now, what does this mean? These people are vassals or part of the provincial system of Assyria. So they are loyal to the center. But here they do not fight against Nabopolassar. They see an approaching army. Their loyalty is to Assyria, but here they decide to give up. And of course, other Assyrian cities do as well, and we're going to talk about that. In the month of Abu, which is August, the army of Assyria prepared for battle in Gablini, and Nabopolassar went up against them on the 12th of the month and of course you got Julian and a Gregorian calendar switching here. He did battle against the army of Assyria, and the army of Assyria retreated before him. He inflicted a major defeat upon Assyria and plundered them extensively. He captured the Manians, who had come to the Assyrians' aid, and the Assyrian officers. On the same day, he captured Gablini. The Manians, as we knew from lectures before, were people, an Iranian people that lived to the south of Lake Urmia. Here we see their involvement in attempting to assist the Assyrians because they had an alliance with them and because they were part of the Assyrian Empire. In the fall, the army of Egypt and the army of Assyria went after the king of Akkad. So what we see here is a back and forth being described. It's not simply that the king of Akkad goes up and destroys Assyria. Nothing happens suddenly. There's a lot of back and forth. This is a protracted international war, literally international. You have Manians being involved. You have Egyptians being involved on the side of the Assyrians. You're going to have the Medes being involved, the Cimmerians, and other people who are an Iranian people, the Scythians getting involved against Assyria. And part of the alliances shift, and sometimes they realign. But really, the interest is to gain power. Each group is self-interested, of course, in this battle. So they go after the Assyrians, and the Egyptians go after Nabopolassar, and they pursue him to the city, but they cannot overtake him, so they withdraw. So there is a lot of marching and withdrawing. In the month of Adaru, again, the army of Assyria and the army of Akkad did battle against one another at this Madanu, a suburb of Arafat, which is Arafu, which is modern Kirkuk, and the army of Assyria retreated before the army of Akkad, which inflicted a major defeat upon the Assyrian army and drove them back to the Zab River. You can kind of see that the Assyrians keep trying. Unfortunately for them, they are defeated in various battles. Sometimes they win, sometimes they do not win. They captured their chariots and horses and plundered them extensively. They took many prisoners, presumably with them, across the Tigris and brought them into Babylon. And we know historically that many Assyrians were taken as captives into cities like Babylon and Borsippa and Uruk and other cities in the south. 615 to 614, the king of Akkad mustered his army and marched along the bank of the Tigris, and in the month of Ajaru, he encamped against Ashur. On the blank, he did battle against the city, but he did not capture it. So he is not able to attack the city of, he's able to attack the city, but he's not able to capture the city of Ashur, meaning the Assyrians successfully defend the city. The king of Assyria then musters his army and pushes the king of Akkad back from Ashur and marched after him as far as Tikrit. That's quite a distance of one army pursuing another, a city on the bank of the Tigris. The king of Akkad stationed his army in the fortress of Tikritin. The king of Assyria and his army encamped against the army of the king of Akkad, which was stationed there, and did battle against them for 10 days. But the king of Assyria did not capture the city. So you have Nabopolassar attacking Ashur, not succeeding in capturing it, and you're going to have the Medes also try to capture certain cities, and they can't capture them. They go back. And then you have the Assyrians attacking a city where Nabopolassar has encamped in Tikrit, and they are unable to capture the city. And so there's a lot of this back and forth. Things have not happened suddenly. Assyria, again, we have to go according to the sources. We do not see the fall of Assyria happening suddenly. The Medes get into the fray and they attack Assyria as the fighting with. Now, the Medes had previously served the Assyrians very loyally for many years. Sometimes they certain tribes got out of hand as far as the Assyrian Empire was concerned, but other times the Medes were good vassals and good part of the provinces, and the Assyrians treated them with due deference, and they brought them into, in fact, into their palaces, and um, many of their children of royal Mede families were taken by the Assyrians and were trained in the fine art of kingship and monarchy. So the Medes had previously been vassals and allies of Assyria. Here we see that the Medes get involved, and in 614, the Medes attack central Assyria. First, they fail to take the city of Tarvishu, which is just north of Nineveh, what is called an area called Sharif Khan today, which has not been dug up extensively. One British archaeologist kind of touched on Tarvishu. This was the place where Assyrian crown princes used to be trained. Ashurbanipal, Sarhaddon, and so on lived in Tarvishu to be trained as kings. They try to take Tarvishu but are unable to, and then they succeed in sacking the great city of Ashur. They desecrate its temples and engage in extensive looting of this city. You could imagine the tons of gold and silver and so on that were carried, and the artwork and the all kinds of material of wealth and significance that was taken out of Assyria, artwork and so on, by the Medes. So the city is extensively looted. It is not entirely destroyed. The king of Babylon, or the king of Akkad, arrives at the site of the city of Ashur, and he sees the desecration, and he is very upset. Although he and the leader of the Medes form an alliance at this time to be against the Assyrians. Here's a good graphic. I think this is a very good map showing kind of an aerial view of the Assyrian city of Ashur, and it shows an attack occurring on the north side of the city here presumably by the Medes. And it shows you kind of where the main palaces and the main ziggurats of the city of Ashur was. Now, the city of Ashur was not the largest of Assyrian cities by any stretch of the imagination, but it was the religious center of the Assyrians. Very important that Nabopolassar never really attacked the temples of the city. And there's a reference by Nabonidus, the last king of Babylon, that when Nabopolassar arrived into the city of Ashur, he was very saddened to see, because remember, a lot of the temples, actually all of the temples, meant something to him. He was although people, of course, of the same religion fight each other, even of the same ethnicity, but he was very saddened to see the desecration. And according to Nabopolassar, desecration of palaces was an abomination for Nabopolassar. He did not want to see the temple of Ashur and the temple of Ishtar and the temple of Nabu in the city of Ashur looted and destroyed as it was by the Medes. But he lost control, obviously, or he did not have control over the Medes. Archaeological evidence also shows us that there was much evidence of destruction in the city of Nimrud, which is Kalhu, which was the second Assyrian empire of significance. It also contains, though, evidence of later habitation. Now, some of this is referred to as squatter habitations. So some places where people come to live are considered to be poor. I'll refer to this more. So the buildings are not, again, there's no center expending money to carry out great building projects. So a lot of these cities now suffer. And so the people that settle there are often referred to by archaeologists as squatters, people who are Assyrian who may have come and lived in the shadow of the great palaces, which were destroyed, and they kind of make makeshift, mud brick houses and are able to live in these places. So there is evidence of that, of later settlements in the city of Nimrud, as well as extensive burning, looting, and destruction during this time. In 613 BC, so 614 BC, you have all this fighting going on in the city of Ashur, and the city of Nimrud is sacked and destroyed. But in 613 BC, a year later, we see the Assyrians mount an attack and head south to attack the Babylonian troops and their allies, the Medes. So although you have the destruction of the city of Ashur and the destruction of the city of Nimrud, you still have an Assyrian king mounting an offensive against his enemies. So things may not have been as bad as we think after the fall of the city of Ashur and the city of Nimrud for the Assyrians to be able to carry out an offensive like this. Unfortunately, this offensive does not succeed because in 612 BC, a year afterwards, the city of Nineveh falls. And this sees the conquest and destruction of Nineveh. The king, Sin Sharu-ushkin, dies defending his city and country. And this is written in the record that the king of Assyria during this time died in the city of Nineveh. What happened to him may be something that archaeologists can tell us more about in the future, as we see today digs and discoveries going on in the land of Assyria, because teams of archaeologists and Assyriologists from Germany and England, the United States, and other countries, Poland, Italy, are engaged in extensive digging in the city of Nineveh, the city of Nimrud, and other sites, including the city of Ashur. Again, the archaeological evidence shows us that the Assyrians definitely underwent a great deal of trauma and death and destruction during this time, and it shows us even in the skeletons of Assyrians. There are various Assyrian bodies, over 40, kind of huddled in, their bodies are strewn in this area that's called the Hazli Gate of Nineveh. And many of the bodies of the skeletons have arrows in them, showing that obviously something went on here and many people were killed. Some of these are children. There's skeletons of children. So the destruction was widespread. There was a lot of killing, of course. But at this time, after the fall of Nineveh, after this tremendous destruction, the Assyrians still have not given up. So again, emphasizing the idea that this was a prolonged international war. What was going on here was something like the First World War, except the Assyrians were not a side on the theater here, they were in the center. Ashur-uballit refuses to submit to the Median king and to Nebuchadnezzar. He fights his way out of Nineveh during the siege. And now Nineveh, one of the problems with Nineveh is, of course, it's a tremendously large city for the time. It is contains something like 100,000 people in the city itself, and its walls are very, very extensive, over 12 kilometers in one area, very hard to defend. So he fights his way, Ashur-uballit II. Now, Ashur-uballit is crown prince, and I emphasize that because the crown prince had to be consecrated as king of Assyria only in the temple of Ashur. So he is crowned um, the prince, not the king, after the fall of Nineveh, possibly in the city of Haran, which becomes, after Nineveh, the last capital of the Assyrians. So he fights his way out, and the people of Babylon, the Chaldeans, Medes, Persians, Scythians, Sumerians, all have attacked Nineveh now, and now they're pursuing, being led by Nabopolassar and Cyaxares of the Medes in alliance with Egypt. The Assyrians fight back. And the Egyptians, of course, the Egyptian pharaohs had been assigned um, by the Assyrians to rule Egypt, and so there was an alliance there. But this, again, points to the international level of the conflict here. This is a very important period of time for Egypt. A weak Assyria is in the interest of Egypt, and it is a situation of stability in the area, in the Levant, which, again, Egypt is interested in. A very out of control Babylon with the Medes is not in the interest of Egypt. So the Egyptians engage in the fighting here with the Assyrians against those pursuing them. And initially, they're able to defend the city of Haran, but later, for a number of years, and then later, they're not able to defend it. And eventually, the city is sacked and destroyed in 609 BC. And this becomes, in 609 BC, the very last stand of the official Assyrian army. We do not hear any more from Ashur-uballit II. We speculate, most historians speculate that he died in the fighting, but we do not know. There are no sources as to his whereabouts or what happens to him. Some pictures of Haran, which is located in Turkey today. Haran, of course, was resettled. The Temple of Sin was again rebuilt, but the city was settled during Islamic times, and many of the ancient Assyrian artifacts and ruins of the city lay beneath the city, which was settled afterwards, more Islamic era cities. The mother of Nabonidus, who was thought to be from Haran herself, speculated, as we all often do, and even in modern times, that this was kind of a divine retribution. So she says in one of her writings, "Sin, king of all gods, became angry with the city and his temple, and went up to heaven, and the city and the people in it became desolate." So this is a reference, and some historians think that Edet Gupi, the mother of Nabonidus, the last king of Babylon, who was very proud to associate herself with Ashurbanipal, as did her son, showing you that really this was not a Babylonian versus Assyrian situation. If you read between the lines here, this was a mother of a king who's referring to herself as born during the time of Ashurbanipal, her king. So this is a reference to divine retribution. So perhaps Edet Gupi, some scholars think, felt that the Assyrians really had been fighting each other for a very long time, and they kind of sinned against each other, as it were. And so Sin, king of all the gods, according to her. And you have, by the way, you have, during different periods of Assyrian history, you have references to certain gods becoming more important than others. It's a little bit like when Catholics revere, or others revere, certain saints more than others. So the favor here is given to Sin, who is thought to be kind of the just king, the king of the gods, according to Edet Gupi. And so it's divine retribution against the Assyrians for engaging in some kind of possibly sinning against each other by waging war against each other. What did the fall of Assyria mean for the Assyrians themselves? So the imperial domains, highly organized and tied to the center of Nineveh, were carved up between the victors, the Medes, seemingly dominating the territories in the northern Zagros area and in the northern areas, including Erbil, while Syria and the Levant and other areas were taken over by the king of Babylon. There is uncertainty over the line of demarcation between what we call the Median Empire and the Neo-Babylonian Empire, which takes over, because now often scholars think that there was even no such thing as the Median Empire, that the Medes simply engaged in fighting against the Assyrians for the purpose of looting the wealth that was in Assyrian cities, and the same with the Scythians and Cimmerians and others. There's evidence for a Babylonian governor of Ashur, and it may be that this marked the northern limit of the Neo-Babylonian rule in this area, with Nineveh being under the Medes. There is reference by later Babylonian king Nabonidus, again, about how the city of Haran is, he's not able to carry out certain plans in the city of Haran because of the Medes in the area, because Haran is being controlled by the Medes. But this is not verified by the archaeological record. Various villages and towns, as well as provincial capitals, the transition in various villages, the transition appears to have been smooth from one administration to the other. In other words, you have areas that survived the trauma of the war. For example, in a place called Tel Sheikh Hamad, a place called Dur Katlimu, according to one German scholar, should change our view about the fall of the Assyrian Empire, because this area continued onwards. This city continued on, and we have tablets in the Assyrian style being written to the Babylonian king going back to 600 BC. So over a decade after the fall of the cities of Assyria, you have Assyrians in Dur Katlimu, which is on the Euphrates, writing to the Babylonian king in their own Assyrian dialect about how things are running in the city. It's an administrative system. Arbela, or the city of Erbil, lived on to become the capital of Othor during Christian times. So the city of Erbil was completely spared, as were many of the other villages in the Assyrian heartland. The role and power of the Medes, as we said before, is not certain. There's no evidence of any administration by the Medes in the cities of Assyria. We find nothing in Nineveh, nothing in Erbil, nothing in Haran, nothing in any of the cities of the Assyrians of similar nature to what we find in the city of Ashur, for example, of a governor that is reporting to Babylon. Or as in the case of, for example, Dur Katlim. There would have been a flight for many Assyrians, of course, this is speculation, into various safe areas initially, the likely a return at some point, or the establishment of new regions for Assyrians, such as in the areas of Akkadi, for example. So there may have been settlement in other places. There is a tablet, and I'm going to have to go kind of fast, so you'll excuse me so I can get to your questions. There's a tablet that is dated to about 400 years earlier of Sin Shar Ushkun, which is copied from the time of the Seleucids, that supposedly the Assyrian king is trying to negotiate with Nabopolassar, the last Assyrian king, and refers to him as the king my lord, a phrase that the Assyrian king had never used before for over 1,000 years. So is this true, or is it kind of a propaganda tablet? We're not sure. This definitely is not the original, so it's a copy hundreds of years later. So there's much speculation about this particular tablet. There is a voice from an Assyrian soldier that kind of is a lonely voice of sorts that that we have. It's a very damaged tablet, and this Assyrian commander is being asked to put together a team of chariots and to send it perhaps to Haran. He's in an outpost north of the city of Nineveh, and he reports back that there is no people anymore, there are no chariots, and he asks, am I alone going to die? Death will come of it. No one will escape. I am done. And this one of the few voices that we have from the Assyrian side about this great defeat of Assyria at this time. So according to Sarah Melville, who's an Assyriologist, there are a number of factors here that and I'll put them in a nutshell. She says that that the reasons for the fall of Assyria was because the Assyrian army and the Assyrian king never really employed an effective defensive strategy. The Assyrians repeatedly took the offense against the Babylonian king, and the Medes' intervention along with the Scythians changed the outcome of this picture. And Melville attributes the success of the Assyrians to really their failure during this time. And she says, great success over a long period of time created the deep-seated conviction that the heartland was inviolate and that warfare was best executed offensively. So the Assyrians were always on the offensive. They knew nothing about defense because they just did not need it. I want to tell you the situation as it exists today after something like 2,500 years. The only areas left in what is called the area of Nineveh today that could be viewed as Assyrian are a series of villages, about 10 villages that are in the Tilkef and Al-Hamdaniya districts of the Nineveh governorate. And this is really all that is left of the Assyrian heartland. So from that time until today, Assyrians have been exiting this area, leaving the heartland. But these villages are a testament to the fact that the Assyrians survived up until this very day in these areas, speaking their ancient language, practicing their culture. They're different, of course. So I want to end with myths about the Great Fall. We said that this was not a sudden occurrence. It had its roots in earlier conflicts within Assyria. This was an international conflict. It was not simply Assyria against the world, nor Assyria against Babylonia. So the idea of people being persecuted and suddenly deciding to overthrow the Assyrian system, not true, no evidence for it whatsoever. The war was not one of quote-unquote independence or involved nationalisms. And I'm surprised to see some authors, reputable historians, use such terms. There is absolutely zero evidence for this idea of nationalism during this time. And there's no semblance of a people seeking independence. The fall of Nineveh did not destroy all cities or towns in the heartland of Assyria. Though palaces suffered extensive damage, other buildings survived. Not all Assyrian people left the cities or towns of Assyria, so the line up from Nahum that the people are all in the mountains, certainly not true, not borne by the evidence on the ground. There is no evidence to suggest that Assyrian culture or religion disappeared. Certainly, it will not disappear during the classes that are coming up on the Neo-Babylonian Empire, on the Achaemenid Empire, on the period of the Parthian Empire. We are going to see the Assyrians survive, not only survive, and practice their religion during the time that Christianity arrives into the heartland of Assyria. As if the destruction wasn't enough, of course, we had these very, I don't know how to describe these people that were in ISIS other than to say that they're simply lacking in all human decency and morality, that they destroyed these places um, and these very very ancient artifacts that were left from our ancestors, and they destroyed them and took a lot of pride. Thank God, people like this are gone from the area. So, what happened to the people of Assyria? Historians have often become confused, such as they've become sometimes even Kuhn-like, Carlton Kuhn-like, thinking that the Assyrians disappeared. However, we have in the person of Professor Simo Parpola, who explains to us that the Assyrians went from the word Assyrian, Athuraya, Ashuraya, to the word Suraya or Syriac. The word Syrian has its roots in the word Assyrian, and we will see these references again and again in the lectures that we take up. I want to leave you with a very inspiring quote for those of you that may believe or not believe. Matthew, we referred before to the Old Testament. I'll refer to a line in the New Testament. The men of Nineveh shall rise in judgment with this generation and shall condemn it, because they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and behold, a greater than Jonah is here. I'm not preaching. I'm just telling you something very interesting about this passage, that the Assyrians convert to Christianity and they take pride in their ancient history and link themselves to this past, even though they've been dispersed all over the world. And I think these pictures, as the saying goes, these pictures speak 1,000 words.